Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the second in the roundtable series of public forums on topical issues. The second one we've had in Parliament House. The first was on the 29th of March, God in Politics, and that was very interesting. This particular forum this evening is called the Multiculturalism and Australian Identity. Now, it's been organised by the Fellowship of the Round Table. Now, we are a long-established discussion and study group aiming to raise consciousness on political, social and cultural issues in the community and to network for creative social change. That's the commercial. I had to say that. Now, I also have to say, this is the disclaimer, we have no links or connections with any other organisation or group whatsoever, whether it's political, religious, cultural, commercial. I think that covers the lot. All funds are spent on information, printed material, and the public meetings we have. We don't have any ulterior motive or hidden agenda, that is for sure. Otherwise, we might be successful. We believe in the importance of culture, individuality, and moral integrity, and in the dignity, value, and liberty of each person. The motto of the fellowship is, "We serve truth, not consensus." So we obviously can't be a political party with that motto. Now, the three speakers we have tonight, we're privileged to have them because each one is a very well-known and respected spokesman in the public arena. Mr. Stephan Kekasharian, Mr. Paddy McGuinness, and Professor David Flint will be talking in that order, and the first two speakers may wish to make a few comments at the end. It's called right of reply. Now, questions will be invited from the audience at the conclusion of the three talks. Raise your hand, keep it short and to the point, and say which particular speaker you're questioning. At 9:30 sharp, we break for supper, because by that stage we will probably be hungry. Now, the first speaker in our lineup, oh, sorry, something else I forgot to mention, if you'll excuse me. If you're interested in being kept in touch for future events, and there will be future events here, all you have to do is fill in the form, and that's this one here with the doodahs at the bottom, name, address, etc. Fill that in and give it to the lady at the front door. And if you're interested in becoming a member of Fellowship, just put a circle around the in joining bit. That's it. You don't have to sign your life away. There's no hidden codicil, nothing like that. Now, I would like, first of all, to introduce Mr. Stephan Kekasharian. He is, he's been the head of SBS radio from 1980 to 1989, and then the head of the New South Wales statutory body, the Ethnic Affairs Commission, and he was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1992, and he's a fellow of the University of Technology, Sydney. And I think also the president of the Anti-Discrimination Board. So he will be our first speaker on the subject of multiculturalism and Australian identity. So welcome, Mr. Kekasharian, please. Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry. This is high technology. I have to give you this. And if you would put it on.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's not forgotten.
I think it works.
Oh, it
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by saying that multiculturalism has never been easy for Australia, and yet it can be seen as one of our country's greatest successes. And I can assure you from where I sit and the amount of interest that exists in multiculturalism, particularly from overseas, it is one of our country's greatest successes. Emerging from a history of highly exclusionary immigration policies and a strong commitment to white Australia, Australia's adoption of this policy since the 1970s has guided the successful political, social and economic integration of peoples from many different cultural backgrounds into a relatively conflict-free society. Without the legislation of federal and state government that outlined community and individual rights and government obligations to multiculturalism, Australia's recent social and political history may have been very, very different. Through multicultural policy, Australia took a bold new path and approach in creating and defining its society. Defined in the 1970s, it was the Australian context not as a oneness, but a unity, not a similarity, but a composite, not a melting pot, but a voluntary bond of dissimilar people sharing a common political and institutional structure. That's how it was defined in 1977. Today, the policy continues to recognize and celebrate Australia's cultural diversity. According to the National Multicultural Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, it accepts and respects the right of all Australians to express and share individual and cultural heritage with an overriding commitment to Australia and the basic structures and values of Australian democracy. Certainly, there is no doubt that the term multiculturalism is controversial, and the definitions and actions used by governments and populations have created their fair share of debate in Australia. But I do not think that because of that we should get rid of it any more than we should get rid of any other hard-working words in our vocabulary, like the words democracy or the word freedom. Nor do I think we should limit ourselves to one meaning. For some time, the concept and the definition of multiculturalism has been misunderstood, and at times it has been manipulated, and there may have been differing views on its meaning. For example, people sometimes still refer to the multicultural community as if multicultural is synonymous to ethnic, and as if multicultural meant separate and non-Anglo-Saxon. I still hear some people saying to me, "Oh, I've got one of those multicultural people living next to me." Now, however, multiculturalism is not a static policy for Australia, but one that over decades has been built and redefined. A recognition of the linguistic, religious, racial and ethnic backgrounds of all citizens and promotion of equal rights and responsibilities forms the backbone of Australia's brand of multiculturalism. It also differentiates our experience from many other parts of the world. We have different, in terms of multiculturalism, we have different definitions, both from a European definition that sees multiculturalism based on separation of identity, leading ultimately to exclusion, and a United States model that focuses on recognizing the contribution of groups traditionally excluded from the dominant canon. In Australia, we have focused on ensuring the full social, economic, and political participation of all members of our society in an increasingly diverse population, and that may be the secret of our success. In New South Wales, Australia's most populous state, almost 1/4 of its residents were born overseas, and 41% have one or both parents born in a country other than Australia. That's based on the 2001 census figures. 41% have one or both parents born overseas. In 2001, at the pinnacle of our commitment, New South Wales became the first state in Australia to put into law the link between the notion of citizenship and the issues of social justice, community harmony, and cultural and economic opportunities in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and multiracial society. New South Wales instilled a respect of difference within the confines of a commitment to Australia and its future. And those are the words in the legislation. This model is proving instrumental in influencing the redefinition of multiculturalism in Australia. And at a time when the concept is being challenged, it could indeed form the basis for a new interpretation internationally. As was the case in many other parts of the world, multiculturalism emerged in Australia in the context of various international as well as domestic trends and forces, such as the impact of decolonisation, shifts in trade links and alliances, and changes in international migration patterns. Despite our successes, there are other lessons we have had to learn. For example, the decimation of Australia's indigenous culture and communities and their forced assimilation into European Australian society through removal of Aboriginal children from their families paints a bleak beginning to the multiracial relations in Australia. Australian governments are still attempting to tackle issues of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations, including, in some cases, symbolic gestures of apology for past injustices. In fact, it may be surmised that the cruel lessons of assimilation learnt through these experiences have greatly influenced Australia's extra tight embrace of multiculturalism. Ironically, while Australia is an immigrant nation, much of its history has been absorbed in controlling its borders to prevent the entry of others. With the assistance of government policies and control, Australian society essentially remained through the first part of the 20th century a cultural derivative of Britain. After federation of the British colonies in Australia in 1901, the new nation continued to shape the local culture to be white and of British origin. Australia's notorious White Australia policy came into force with the Federation. Successive British and then Australian governments, up until the Second World War, dealt with ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities primarily by enforcing gatekeeping mechanisms for outsiders, while attempting to enforce the assimilation of minorities, such as the Indigenous population, through strict control of their democratic and civil rights. In fact, Indigenous populations were deliberately excluded from the 1901 Constitution at the Federation of the British Colonies as Australia. Aborigines were not legally citizens in their own country. They were not counted in the referendum until the 1967 referendum changed the legislation and the Constitution. Population and safety concerns after the Second World War led to a loosening of Australia's tight immigration laws, allowing significant numbers of European migrants. Assimilation and monoculturalism was seen as the way of meeting Australia's population needs and ensuring that non-British immigration did not undermine the Australian way of life. The emphasis on maintaining Australian tradition forced new Australians to break with old country, its language, traditions of dress, dance, culture, ceremonies, and social relationships. And that's according to Collins in his publication in 1991. Providing special services to new Australians went against the assimilation ideology. Migrants were trapped in a catch-22, writes Collins. They had to learn English to successfully assimilate, yet they were not given any special support in that process. But by the mid-1960s, welfare and education services for a growing non-English speaking population were demanded. By the mid-1970s, a shift to multicultural policy was supported on all sides of politics. In 1970s, multiculturalism was very much about protecting minority rights. Now it encompasses various forms of government and individual responsibilities as well. In his submission to the inquiry into multiculturalism by the New South Wales Legislative Council in 1999, the then Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Bob Carr, outlined a new government vision for cultural diversity, and I quote, "Multiculturalism cannot be constructed as a policy which affects only certain groups in our society, the ethnics. Multiculturalism can only succeed if it engages everyone in its most powerful expression as a policy recognizing individual identity and participation on an equal basis for all." End of quotes. Therefore, in 2001, the New South Wales government, through the Parliament of New South Wales, enacted groundbreaking legislation, the Community Relations Commission and the Principles of Multiculturalism Act. The legislation was a first in Australia to make explicit the link between the notion of citizenship and the issues of social justice, community harmony, and the cultural and economic opportunities in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multiracial society. What drives the New South Wales legislation is an effort to reduce the marginalisation of its citizens by enhancing their level of participation in all aspects of life in this state. Under this framework, ethnicity, race, language, and religion should not play any part in determining or defining the status of a citizen. So too, the loyalty and commitment of a citizen to a state should not relate to the individual's race, religion, language, and ethnicity. They should have the right to self-identification by way of any of those identifiers. Australia is moving beyond legislative assurances of equality for minorities. There is also an increasing realization that the recognition of absolute specific rights for specifically identified and separate ethnic, religious, racial, and linguistic minorities can lead to social fragmentation, to political fragmentation, and ultimately to conflict. Despite good intentions, based on identifiable needs, we have learnt that public policies that seek to meet the needs of specific communities because of their minority status within a society may not always result in their intended long-term benefits. Instead of creating opportunities, such policies run the risk of marginalizing groups by limiting their participation and reducing opportunities to assume leadership positions within the greater community. In these instances, well-meaning policies might end up destroying the very rights they intend to establish and to maintain for minorities. Hence the need for a multicultural state to assume a stronger focus on citizenship and inclusion in its public policies is essential. The relationship between governments and the people of their states, including newcomers, is ultimately determined by the notion of citizenship. It is citizenship which establishes the rights of an individual and the reciprocal obligations of the state towards that citizen. In New South Wales, the Community Relations Commission and the Principles of Multiculturalism Act represents an opportunity for various communities, including Indigenous people, to relate to citizenship in a new way. Allowing all people the right to self-identification as citizens gives them freedom of choice and the right to form communities instead of community groupings being mandated by government. This means that the concept of a community of communities and the culture of cultures are now the building blocks of our society. The role of government in this area is still evolving. However, policies and guidelines of multiculturalism still remain the critical framework for such development. Much has been said recently by various opinion leaders, high-profile columnists and others that multiculturalism has lost its way. It has lost its way in meeting the needs of minority populations both in Australia and overseas. This may be true using past definitions, but as we know from history, that it has not and it will never be a static term. As societies and citizens' needs change and develop, so too must the policies governments develop to meet those needs. It is through strong legislation that a real commitment to a harmonious multicultural society can be developed. Emerging from highly exclusionary and assimilationist immigration policies, the Australian and in particular the New South Wales examples is testament to the need for not only nimble government policy in working with cultural diversity, but a commitment to go beyond lip service. We have made sure that commitments to meet the needs of all members of society are built into government services. Multiculturalism has continuously found its way in Australia because of government policies that utilise citizenship as a unifying force and ensures the equal participation of all citizens. One can virtually formulate the success of a harmonious, multilingual, multiracial, multi-faith and multi-ethnic society. We do not have laws or public policies which bestow privileges on specifically identified minorities. That is not the essence of multiculturalism. It is not, multiculturalism is not a license for a particular minority. Balancing this way, having laws and public policies which enforce equality on the one hand and guarantee the right to self-identification is the best balance to deal with the challenges of our society. In this context, multiculturalism guarantees all citizens absolute equality when underpinned by inclusive public policies of participation, service delivery, and decision-making processes. Its success is built on shared values and demands a unified commitment by all citizens to the land in which they live, to Australia, and to its future. That's what the Act says, and that's what multiculturalism is. It is all very simple. There's one condition. We have to throw away our prejudices. Oh, sorry.
Tech strikes again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kisharian, for that very comprehensive overview of multiculturalism. And it had power and fine-tuning, and I learned an awful lot in a very short time about multicultural policy. It was a very good introduction indeed. Our next speaker is Mr. Paddy McGuinness. He has worked as an economist in England and France, lectured at the University of London, and has been a distinguished social and political commentator for many years. He's currently a columnist of the Sydney Morning Herald. Aren't you anymore? Oh, I'm sorry, I've got out-of-date information. Okay, well there we are. I'll delete that bit. It's got a red line through it. A red lion ran through that. But you're still the editor of Quadrant. That part's correct. Welcome, Paddy McGuinness, please. Have to get the censor onto that. There you go. Could you just clip that onto your lapel or put it in your pocket? So that you know, permanent, imperishable.
Yeah, sure. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I find myself in a position of both agreeing and disagreeing with Stepan Kekisharian. As to the meritorious and desirable nature of multiculturalism, I have nothing to disagree about. As to the practicalities of policies relating to multiculturalism, I have much to disagree about, because unfortunately the term has acquired very many meanings. and not all of them praiseworthy. However, let me start by an historical point or two. I have lived for years in Balmain, Sydney. Now, Balmain is probably thought of as one of the most Anglo or Anglo-Celtic areas of Sydney, and indeed it was. In 100 years ago, it was the most densely populated suburb in Australia. All these little bijou residences that exist now usually had families of 5 or 6 children, and of course there were no such thing as cars. Most of the vast majority of the residents worked for the maritime industry in one sense or another. Now, what surprised me years ago, when I went to something for a reason, I had to go to a function at the Balmain Rowing Club, which is near Elkington Park, just beside Elkington Park in Balmain. It's a very old park. And I was looking around and I noticed one of these honour boards of people who had suffered, killed, or I think mainly killed, in the First World War. And the thing that surprised me was how many of the names were non-Anglo-Celtic. How many of them were European. There were names that were clearly Central European, some Eastern European, but mainly Central European or Southern European. But these were the members of the rowing club, which was one of the most important social institutions of Balmain back then, just about the time of the foundation of the Labor Party. Now this raises some questions about the general depiction of Australia as always having been monocultural. In fact, even on the Anglo-Celtic thing, it was never monocultural. I can tell you, as somebody from Irish background, Irish origin, although about 4 or 5 generations in Australia, I know perfectly well. I remember from my youth, thank God it's disappeared, as the strong feeling between the people who identified with Ireland and the people who identified with Britain, and the sectarian prejudice which existed then. Now happily that's disappeared. But it also reminded me of the fact, when I thought about it, that there are also quite a few Chinese in Australia at the time. There were, of course, the people who came out, mainly, first of all, perhaps to look for gold in the gold rush. Then they became market gardeners, then they became established Australian residents. In fact, it was quite typical, and I barely remember it, I'm not old enough for that, but many people older than me remember it, when Chinese market gardeners were a well-known presence in the cities as well, selling produce. Now, they were separate, but they were not discriminated against. And as you can see, or as you could see, that many of their children, of course, became businessmen or went to university, or and of course they're thoroughly established. Many of them, unfortunately, don't speak Chinese anymore, or whatever their dialect of Chinese was originally, but they're undeniably Chinese. Now, one of the big changes that took place in Australia in the early part of last century was the First World War, and that was the origin of much of the prejudice against Europeans, non-Anglo, non-Celtic Europeans. And of course, particularly the totally irrational hatred of Germans or German-seeming names, anything like that. It was a very unsavoury period. But there were nevertheless quite a few people who had actually entered quite freely, without discrimination, from Europe before the First World War. Now, the White Australia policy was raised by Mr. Kikisharian. Well, of course the White Australia policy existed. What were its origins?